We gotcha.
Thanks for having us. We really appreciate it. I'm really excited to be delivering this content to you and have my partners in crime, Dave DeSillis and Steve Murphy, with us to deliver a majority of this content to you. Let's go to the next slide, Lindsay. I'll have you advance us. All right, cool. So my name is Mike Schonholtz. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at ARG, but more importantly, I wanted to introduce my two coworkers, David DeSillis and Steve Murphy. We've known Dave for a long time. In fact, he was a customer of ARG's for nearly, 10, 15 years before joining our team officially in the last year. Let's go back to the last slide. Dave's been in the IT industry for 25 years. He offers real-world knowledge of how to gain buy-in and roll out new technology. Dave is a former CIO. He's made technology purchasing decisions and overseen countless infrastructure and software implementations. During his previous role, he built out an IT staff, systems for transformation, for IT acquisition and rollout strategies for one of the nation's leading trucking and logistics organizations. So Dave's recently joined us to help us build out and continue to advance our network and security strategy on behalf of our clients. Steve Murphy also has been in the industry for 25 plus years. Steve comes to us with a wealth of knowledge, both in product marketing, finance. He's a CPA by trade. He's a former auditor from Arthur Andersen, now Accenture, has held leadership positions in corporate finance, accounting, and product management. And Steve's role primarily on behalf of our customers is to help them and analyze the risk and the financial impact of new technology decisions. And Steve also holds a master's in finance from Georgetown University. So these two gentlemen will be primarily delivering the content to you today and helping you understand some of the opportunities that you might be able to take advantage of. So let's go to the next slide. Just a quick second about ARG. The only constant in IT is change. There's no way one IT team could keep it all straight and all plugged in. And frankly, the margin for error now, right at this very moment, is thinner than ever. What we'll cover today is learnings from nearly 2,000 client engagements. So we're extending our research, our data to you today. Real stories from your peer group that we've captured over the last 12 months. Certainly there's lots of places you can go for this information. You can Google it. You can look at suppliers that are presenting to your organization. You can use Gartner and Forrester. I think we're uniquely positioned to add value and provide clarity as we live in the trenches. We implement these technologies alongside of our customers versus writing book reports. We really are alongside of our customers and helping them achieve the larger business value that they would expect from implementing new technologies. Let's go to the next slide. So what's happened in the last several months that's kind of brought us to this point where in the engagements that we're having with our clients, what we're hearing is cloud's no longer the exception, it's the rule. Every single organization is looking at their infrastructure and their applications and going SaaS infrastructure or platform as a service. Those that did that pre-COVID had a much easier time than those that carried technology debt into the pandemic. And in fact, we ask every one of our customers the same question to start every one of our engagements, especially now more relevant than ever. How many of your coworkers are going to continue to work remotely? And what we're getting back is anywhere from 20 to 40% of their staff will no longer report to a physical office. So what does that mean? Instead of having 1 to 3 to 5 locations, they now have hundreds of locations potentially of people's home office. And the reality is, cybercrime has now become a mature and significant business in many parts of the world. Meaning, if you were to experience a hack, you could go to a website. They would sell you ransomware as a service. There's a fax page. There's a, how do we make this the best experience for you possible videos. It's actually unbelievable. And right now, we've become more exposed than ever because we can't protect our coworkers or our infrastructure like we did even 2 years ago. In the comfort of the 4 walls of our office, we've become more and more decentralized. Let's go to the next slide. The one takeaway that I would have from this, from the beginning here, is hackers are generally a pretty lazy bunch. They're more purse snatchers than sophisticated masterminds. Like I said, you could build malware as a service. They're heavily motivated, financially motivated. In fact, almost 90% of breaches were financially motivated. They want to help you through this process, and they want to get in the easiest way possible. What we're going to cover today are some really practical ways that you can significantly improve your position to keep the bad guys out without having to make these massive investments or huge pivots in the way that you're ultimately deploying technology. We're going to give you some practical ways that you can maybe be a little smarter about the way you deploy technology. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next slide, actually. This is, you guys know, pandemic, more hacks, more money. Let's go to the next slide. What we've seen most recently is, despite many organizations still recovering from both the pandemic and from supply chains being disrupted, IT spending going from 21 to 22 is increasing by low to mid single digits. But 70% of organizations are significantly increasing their security spending because of the graphic on the right. The ransomware damage costs have doubled again in 2021, and we would expect that to happen again in 2022. Many of you are reading the headlines. I don't need to highlight those to you all. But what is another interesting fact is that 70% of businesses have not purchased any form of cyber liability insurance or data breach coverage. And the insurance companies are getting more sophisticated in the questions that they're asking organizations. In order to even be quoted premiums, there's a minimum level of accountability that organizations have themselves to protect data. We'll unpack that a bit in some of the slides coming up, but it's really surprising to know that not only are businesses not taking that incremental step, what you'll see is we sort of, as we unpack the ransomware attack that we'd like to share with all of you, that cyber insurance, cyber liability insurance, was one of the ways that organization was able to move very quickly to resolution. Literally $100,000 SOWs passing across the CFO's desk, and without thinking, she was able just to sign them, right? She didn't have to think about, oh my gosh, do we have budget? What's going to be the impact to us financially for this particular service? They were able to move quickly, and it was because of their cyber insurance they were able to do that. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment.
Hey, Mike,
go to the next slide, Lindsay.
Mike, if I could jump in, if you could go back to that previous slide real quick. I want to point one thing out here that we're seeing a trend in. So that middle piece, 70% of organizations increasing security spending. It used to be that security was an afterthought. People did it when they got hit. Years ago, when I was planning budgets, it didn't always make it in there. Now it's becoming a cost of doing business, as we'll see with cyber insurance, but really the protective side of the equation too. So I just want people to be aware that that is a trend now that we're seeing.
Phenomenal. Thanks for adding that, Dave. So let me talk just a little bit about what we hope you guys are going to get out of this today. So we're going to focus on 3 practical ways to strengthen your approach to security. The first is a layered approach where you can deploy multiple controls for maximum protection. Don't think of these as necessarily incremental investments that you have to make. There are ways that you can deploy technology more smartly and get a huge increase to things like business continuity, disaster recovery, backup, ability to survive during a potential event. Ways that you can protect your data. If you can't describe how you're protecting your data, you probably aren't. And then we'll talk about, just again, practical, do you have a security elevator pitch? Does the auditor stay 5 minutes or 5 days or 5 months, right? And we've got Dave and Steve to provide us some practical and real world experience there. But I think we've got our first question. With this summary in mind, I'm going to then turn it over to Steve Murphy and let him start to focus on sort of the first approach there. But let's get to our first question. Do you know someone who has been the victim of a cybersecurity attack? And you can enter that into the chat. My gosh, this is so great because it's literally yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. It looks like
a lot of yeses.
60%. Yeah, maybe a little more with yeses, which isn't surprising. I mean, it's one of those things that you just don't know. It's not like everyone's walking around the dinner party talking about how they got hacked last week and their client data is now out, on the dark web. So we're hoping that the first thing that we demonstrate to you is we've actually taken some time to really dissect hour by hour what happens during a ransomware attack. I think we all get the headlines. We know Colonial Pipeline was hacked. We know they paid a ransom. but what happened in the hours and days after they discovered that they had been breached? What actually happened? And I think what you'll see from this is there was a lot this particular client did right, and there was a few areas or opportunities for improvement. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve Murphy and let him walk us through that.
Thanks, Mike. Lindsay, if we could go to the next slide. Appreciate it. So as Mike stated, the world has changed, right? We are now in what we refer to as a brave new world. 5 years ago, most of the IT production stack was either on-prem or maybe in a private data center cage or cabinet. Today, most of the IT stack has moved out into the cloud. Yet our security strategy and our security posture really hasn't changed that much. We've moved our security into the cloud, but the strategies are the same. We're still using firewalls. We're still using endpoint protection on local machines, and we're still having everyone access that security stack over a private connection, 20-year-old technology, virtual private network or VPN. So forcing people back into a security stack is very inefficient, and people will want to try to find ways around that because it does result in user experience issues. Now, this graphic on the right, one of the things I noted when I first saw this is that most of the terms and many of the logos on this were not household names 5 years ago. That's how much our world has changed. But again, our security posture hasn't. So we're going to unpack that just a little bit. But before we do, we have another question. And someone actually alluded to it, I saw in the comments. Lindsay, could you advance to the next slide? Sorry. We're going to talk about the layered approach. But the question is, someone alluded to in the comments, when IT is off the clock, maybe you have an expansive organization in many time zones. When IT is off the clock, how do you know if you've been hacked outside of normal business hours? If you could put that in the chat response, I'd appreciate it.
Might have stumped him.
This is very common.
Party stock monitoring.
Right.
Yep. not really sure.
Yep. It's
not sure. Don't know.
Yeah. Very common.
Software. Service
Some
provider,
folks seem to
hopefully.
have
Right.
That's a good one.
after
So
hours.
while people continue to respond, Lindsay, let's go to the next slide. So we're going to unpack this layered approach. And by layers, what we mean is that your cybersecurity strategy has to have multiple points to catch threatening or potentially threatening events. And I'll just give you an example. If your firewall were tuned so tightly that it eliminated 100% of the threats that it encountered, it would also eliminate a lot of valid traffic by being tuned so tightly. So we have to tune our firewalls appropriately. That means that some potential threatening activity or traffic might get through. So we need another layer someplace else in the network, hopefully multiple layers that would evaluate that event or potential event and block it if necessary. So that's what we're going to talk about in the first section of this presentation. Let's go to the next slide. And to sort of introduce this idea of layers, we'll talk about an actual hacking event, a security incident that one of our clients experienced, and we were able to experience it with them. I won't say we were privileged to, but we had the opportunity to literally work shoulder to shoulder with them as they identified, managed, mitigated, and remediated this event. And the event started over a weekend, actually in the early morning hours of a Monday. And to the previous question, the client wasn't aware. The client wasn't aware until 7 a.m. when their employees started to log in. The early risers got on the network and they all of a sudden couldn't access the resources that they had been working on just the previous week. So they alerted IT, and IT went into their admin portals. They checked their monitoring and saw that the domain controller had been accessed earlier that morning. And there was a lot of file writing activity that had occurred in the last several hours. At 8 o'clock, the client IT organization declared a breach, sent an email out to the entire staff saying, don't use anything. We've got an incident that we're working. They began to triage the event. A ransom note was discovered embedded in some of the directories that had been encrypted. This was a ransomware event, by the way. I hadn't mentioned that. So there were many of the clients' files had been encrypted. The ransom note indicated that they had 72 hours to respond and pay the ransom, or the ransom would begin to escalate. And then they had also threatened to expose data that they claimed to have exfiltrated or stolen from the client, expose that information on the public internet. That's what we call a double ransom. So the first ransom is, you want your data back so you can continue to operate your business, you have to pay us. The second ransom is, you want your data to be kept private or and not exposed on the public internet, you have to pay us again.
Hey, Dave, Steve,
Yeah.
Real quick, you said that they had 72 hours to respond. When does that clock start? Does it start at 7 a.m. or does it start at some other period of time?
Well, we'll get to that. What the client was advised of later on in the day, when they actually had literally a team of experts assembled. It's a really interesting story as to how this was. But the negotiator that they engaged recommended that they not contact the hacking organization from that ransom note until they were ready to, because that's when the clock starts to tick with the hacker, is when they get contacted, and that's when things start to escalate. It's a great question.
Hey, last
So at
question
9
for you,
o'clock.
this is coming in over the. Sorry to interrupt you again. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I
So,
appreciate monitor the chat.
I don't know if ever. All right, cool. If there's no, just in case you guys aren't watching the chat, good question came in from Adam. So this is a traditional Active Directory network with domain controls and file servers. Dave, you responded to that.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a hybrid AD. So there was a file server and DCs in a co-location facility, but everything replicates. They did have an Azure and Microsoft 365 environment too.
Right. So it was a private cloud environment. They actually had someone managing their cloud environment, the private cloud environment for them in the data center. So early in the morning, we're still at 9 o'clock. Incident has been declared. Initial triage showed that their private environment was substantially impacted, but their public environment, their Office 365 services, did not look to be significantly impacted. So, the client initially reached out to a number of vendors. This is when ARG was engaged, but they also reached out to their MSP, obviously the cloud service provider, and their backup and recovery provider. Now, ARG had helped them coordinate all of those vendors, so they had asked us to get involved and help that coordination through while they were fighting fires internally. But importantly to note, in terms of the layered approach, one of the things that they did was they did have a third-party disaster recovery company. They had their backup and recovery outside of the vendor that managed their production environment. So they had, they were confident that they had something that they could fall back onto. At that point, we also had an all-staff call that got all the employees on a single bridge, and they informed them what was happening. They gave them further instruction about what to do and what not to do. They were allowed to continue to operate on email since the Office 365 environment didn't appear to be impacted, but only through a web browser, not going into the actual Outlook application. They were allowed to continue to use the SaaS applications that they also use, like Salesforce.com and so forth, things that were physically and virtually separate from the incident itself. At 10 o'clock, after they had reached out to the insurance provider to let them know that they had an incident going on, the insurance provider actually provided them a number of resources that they could access, including a law firm. And a law firm I would recommend to everyone is the first person you want to reach out to. I know you want to fix things, you want to get things back and restored, but a lawyer who specializes in a cybersecurity event will be a very important guide as to what you can do and what you can't do to restore your services and to interact with a potential bad actor. So at 11 o'clock, the client was informed by their cloud service provider that something really important had happened the night before. the cloud service provider was entering into a maintenance window, and they had taken a snapshot of their environment, including their servers and all the virtual desktops that were being hosted there. That snapshot appeared to have happened prior to the bad actor accessing the network. So there was an opportunity here to potentially restore services from a snapshot that had happened just hours prior to the incident occurring. Some additional triage actually showed that the Office 365 environment was impacted much more than previously thought. So a note went out to the employees saying, get off of email, get off of your Microsoft email. A client had a third-party email security provider, Mimecast, that had a web portal email viewer that they could fall back on, so they could actually continue to operate on email through Mimecast rather than through Microsoft and through Outlook, allowing them to completely push back from the Microsoft environment. Also importantly, they were continuing to be able to use their voice services, their hosted voice services, because they hadn't centralized their voice services on Teams. If they had had Teams as their voice service provider, they would have had to stop using Teams as their communication platform, but because they were using a third-party communication platform, that was also intact.
So let me just pause you there for a second, because one of the things I had foreshadowed early was it doesn't necessarily mean you have to make incremental investments. That's a good example of they deployed voice services, leveraging the enterprise investment in Teams they had already made, but they used a third-party proprietary over-the-top UCaaS provider, which essentially dollar for dollar doesn't cost any more than doing all Teams, right?
Right.
But provided them an increased level of business continuity during an event. So that I love that this is one of the things they did really right. Sometimes better to be lucky than smart, right?
Right, and just in terms of taking the friction out of this event, if they had lost their communications platform and everyone had to go back to cell phones, they weren't, trying to coordinate the entire organization through cell phones would have been a complete nightmare and really delayed their ability to focus on the tasks at hand. So still on the same day, just a few hours into this, by lunchtime, they have an attorney on board, and the attorney helps them understand the rest of the team that they need to assemble. We'll get to that in just a moment. But by 1 o'clock, the cloud service provider comes back and says, good news, these snapshots appear to be clean. We've unpacked them in a secure environment. They don't appear to have any corruption. And we're going to start restoring the servers first, and then we'll worry about the desktops later on. At this point, also based upon the insurance recommendation and the lawyer's recommendation, the client engaged a forensic vendor. So a forensic vendor is someone that helps investigate, understand what happened, and helps the organization recover. At 2 o'clock, the servers are restored just an hour later. So things are already beginning to get back to some semblance of normalcy. The forensics firm actually recommended yet another participant in this, and that is a cyber negotiator, someone who is skilled and expert and understanding how to maximize the interaction between a hacker and the person that they are targeting. One of the other important things at 3 o'clock, until this point, the client had no idea how the hack had occurred, what the entry point was. So the MSP was able to identify that by mid-afternoon and shut that down. Because if you don't identify the entry point, there's nothing to keep the hacker from coming back in and reintroducing the malicious activity onto the network. Late afternoon, the negotiators on board with a statement of work and advises don't contact the hacker. To the conversation we had earlier from Mike's question, as soon as you contact the hacker, the clock starts to tick on their timeline, and they'll start to escalate the ransom demands and so forth. By early evening, the cloud service provider confirmed that all of the virtual desktops that were hosted on the cloud service provider were also cleaned, and they start to rebuild desktops. Now they can only do those in batches of 5 to 8 at a time. So that's a process that literally took the entire night to rebuild the organization. The last thing that happened in this day one or day zero of the incident was a call with the attorney to recap all of the activities that had transpired and get some advice for how to proceed with the negotiator and the forensics expert. So a 12-hour span, we went from a disastrous incident to a recovery process that had been undertaken. It was a remarkable chain of events, a little bit of luck involved. If they hadn't had this snapshot from the cloud service provider, their third-party disaster recovery provider would have been able to reestablish their services. That was a 48-hour interval to stand up an alternate environment in the disaster recovery provider's cloud environment, but the customer could have used that for up to 30 days without charge while they rebuilt their internal system. So they knew that there was a backstop and a safety net there. So Lindsay, if we can go to the next page to talk about what happened in the succeeding days. Yeah.
We have a few great questions in chat.
Yeah, sure.
Before we move on, we have whether it makes sense to start restoring services before you identify the entry point.
Well, that's a good question. I think in terms of things that could have been done better, maybe that was an opportunity for improvement that we learned from. You're absolutely right. We should have had an understanding of that entry point before we restored services.
And then Vinny asked if that process was documented. Vinny, can you expound on what process you're asking about specifically?
Yeah, I was just thinking, that process of recovery. We have a lot of documents over here at our company, and I review them, but sometimes when this stuff happens, it's kind of like you try to follow the process, but you just don't know. But
right.
I would assume you'd want some things documented.
So there was a process that was documented, but it was not a cohesive process. There were incremental processes for the various vendors, but there was no playbook for an incident such as this. So another opportunity for the client going forward was to actually assemble playbooks and do tabletop exercises and understand how things would evolve and the steps that need to be taken. Going back to that previous question, probably want to identify the entry point and shut that off before services are restored.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Steve, one thing that I know when you and Dave were telling us this story the other day, as we were preparing for this, you had said that based on the code, I think I'm saying that appropriately, was the forensics company generally knew the hacking organization, and then the hacking organizations are getting sophisticated and consistent in their playbooks. So just by understanding the code, they were able to say it's one of these two hacking organizations, and we know that if you do this, this, and this, their response is going to be that, and that.
Correct.
Could you just 30 seconds on that?
Yeah, and that's actually part of the day two activity that happened. So once the forensics organization was able to get a copy of the logs and get examples of the files that had been impacted, they were able to identify with pretty good accuracy a small list of potential hacking organizations that they thought were involved. And they were able to work with the negotiator to come up with a negotiation strategy. So on day 3, the negotiator actually reached out to the hacker and said, okay, we know what you did. We're reaching out to work with you to try to resolve this. First step is, let's send you one of the encrypted files, and you send us back a decrypted file to prove that you actually have the decryption keys before we even talk about paying a ransom. And so that happened, and the hacker was able to return a decrypted file, proving that they had the decryption keys. And the negotiator was then able to say, okay, well, you're also threatening to publish our information, the client's information on the public internet. Send us an example of some of the data that you have exfiltrated. Now, they were not able to produce a different file, separate file from the one that they had just decrypted, demonstrating that they had any proprietary information from the client. So the negotiator at that point said, we're not that interested in pursuing this conversation. Client's been completely restored, and I'll get back into that restoration story in just a moment, because there are a few details that happen in the day two that I think are important. But the client's been completely restored, pound sand, essentially, we're done. Because they couldn't provide a separate file from the client that demonstrated that they had exfiltrated information, all of the regulatory, all of the legal, all of the PR, customer notification issues that many people are subject to were not on the table for this particular client. It was a big bullet that was dodged in that regard, that the negotiator was very confident the hacker didn't have any proprietary information from the client. So just getting back a little bit to day two activity, because there's a really important element here. One of the great saving graces that this client had was that they had a virtual desktop environment. One of the big efforts that was required in this remediation activity was now every user had a clean desktop that they had to go into that next morning. There was a company-wide conference call. It lasted for hours as people essentially opened up a new desktop and changed all their passwords, reset their Outlook settings, and customized their environment to the extent possible within those couple of hours. And the IT organization kept this bridge open actually for more than a day to help people just get in as needed and get help reconfiguring and resetting up their environment. But it was a fantastic effort, fantastic strategy by the client to restore full operations to this organization literally about 27 hours after it was identified.
And Steve, if I could jump in, give a little bit of context here. The user configuration or the user environment is something that's commonly overlooked. So take two different examples. You've got folks with just, hard PCs, they're not virtual. If those machines get compromised, you have to rebuild them. What's the strategy to get all of their stuff back, their settings? Right? Because that wastes a lot of time when you're reconstituting an environment. The printers, the Outlook settings, where your icons are, all these things, these personalizations take a lot of time to restore. In a virtual environment, there are products where you can restore those settings as is. So if this client would have had that, it would have shortened that time.
Yeah, it's a great question. So if, especially in a remote work environment, if users' laptops are bricked, essentially locked and unusable, as does happen from in some of these occurrences, not only with ransomware, but with other type of incidents, literally you need physical access to that machine. So you need everyone to come into the office and have a golden image reestablished and go through that process again. And that's a much more individual basis where you have to ship out thumb drives to everyone and try to do it virtually. It's a much more difficult process there if you don't have a virtual desktop environment.
I think we had a couple of questions in there, Erica, right? Folks were asking. First one, David, what if they hadn't taken the snapshot? Well, I don't know what their RPO, their recovery point objective was for previous backups. It probably would have been an older backup.
Yeah, well, the recovery point was they were taking 2 backups a day. So what probably would have been sometime late in the day, the previous day. But the key disadvantage or the key advantage that this first snapshot provided was speed. The interval that the disaster recovery provider and the client had subscribed to was a 48-hour restoration interval. So they would have to wait at least 2 hours before they could have started getting everyone back to business. So they saved a day, literally, of operating capacity by just having the advantage of this cloud service provider snapshot available to them.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the point of knowing what your business requirements are and how fast do you need, specific systems restored. That all, comes through a business impact analysis when you start to develop your business continuity plans, your recovery time objectives, your recovery point objectives. That's where that all comes in.
Right.
Hey,
And
one
then,
point, and you guys can move on, but the just as you think about, we've seen in the news, or at least over the last year or two, where the MSP has been the point of attack versus or some piece of equipment that's in the MSP's environment.
Mm-hmm.
Just again, maybe reiterate some of the ways that you can help protect the business, knowing that now you've got others potentially touching critical data or responsible for that infrastructure.
So I'll answer it quickly, and then Dave, if you want to augment, feel free. So we always do recommend that our customers have their business continuity platform at a third party, not with their MSP, not with the people who are hosting their production platform, because by consolidating, it seems very easy, seems very logical. We're going to have our production and our backup with the same people, so it's a very easy changeover if you need to fall back to that backup. But that does expose you, single point of failure, to that MSP. If that MSP is hit, both your production and your backup might be jeopardized. So we always recommend people have third-party air-gapped recovery platforms that provides that layer of resiliency that we talked about as sort of the core concept of this section of how you protect your infrastructure.
So
Dave,
best practice, investing in good DR, testing backups, good best practice. But again, another kind of opportunity where if you look at supplier diversity and then some of that air gapping and the ability to kind of get more out of that investment, if you're going to spend the money with a single provider, that could be a point where you choose a second provider, best of breed backup DR, and you can increase your business continuity and resiliency that much more without spending much more.
Correct. You good, Dave?
Yeah,
okay, let's go to the next slide.
Oh yeah.
So just a couple, 2 slides on learnings from this. So from a technology perspective, what worked for the client is that not only did they have reasonable cybersecurity posture, and I should say, by the way, the entry point for this event was an open router port, and so it was not something that their security posture necessarily wasn't able to prevent. If they had a threat assessment or penetration test, they probably would have been able to identify that open port. But they did have pretty substantial security assets in place, but they also had business processes to help them through this, including diverse platforms for their business continuity and other critical systems. As I mentioned before, the client used Mimecast, which allowed them to operate their email, which was their primary mode of communicating with clients in particular, throughout this event. So that was very important. The client's cloud-first strategy, moving their customer support platform over to a SaaS environment, specifically Salesforce, and using a third-party unified communications platform, again, not trying to concentrate everything in a single provider, but getting some provider diversity, allowed them to continue functioning, if not fully functioning, throughout this event. They had also set up some Microsoft security features that did provide some alerting and did provide them some information to help isolate and identify the risk. Their desktop as a service solution, their hosted desktops, allowed them to manage what user access and also restore very quickly. And then, as we just talked about, their third-party offsite backup was also available to them. Lindsay, let's get to the next slide about business processes for this customer. So these are some of the human factors and some of the business decisions that the client had made. So the client had actually spent a lot of time training their users to always notify IT of potential events. So there was a very open, very collegial environment between IT and the user community. We mentioned that they had disparate locations, not only virtual locations, but physical locations for many of their key elements, key business continuity elements. We mentioned their ability to remotely control users, machines, and the users were accustomed to having that that IT influence within their daily operations. The cyber insurance element of this is critical. Mike had a slide earlier which showed that 68% of organizations still don't have cyber insurance. But the cyber insurance environment or the experience was fantastic for this customer. Not only did the cyber insurance company pay for all of the incremental costs, minus the deductible of this event, but they also provided some very important guidance and vendor recommendations to help the customer through this in a very quick fashion. They also had a very competent MSP, managed service provider, IT vendor, who was able to dedicate resources to the client for that day and beyond to help them through this issue on their side. So they had an MSP that had resources that they could devote. And then they also had a fantastic, very flexible, very attuned to the organization IT staff. The organization trusted them implicitly, and I think they came through with flying colors. So I haven't been monitoring the chat. Any questions to get to before we get to our official question? We good? Okay.
There are a few. You'd asked, someone asked for a list of resources, and we'll be sending out the deck afterwards to everyone that's registered. And we can also provide a link to a cybersecurity insights guide with more information.
So if you're going to survive a ransomware attack, you have to have a great backup strategy. And so our question here is, when was the last time, or have you tested your ability to fully recover from a ransomware attack, leveraging your current backup and DR solution? If you could put that answer in the chat to get your CPE validation, we'd appreciate it.
Lots of not sure's and no's, which is not uncommon.
No, it's very common. Yeah, unfortunately, in fact, we've had clients who hadn't tested it, and then when they needed it, they realized that it actually wasn't functioning as they had intended. So testing is super important. I think, Dave, as we are continuing to get some of these responses, we can move on to the next section so you can talk more about what the client could have done better.
Yeah, so nobody's perfect, right? So what are the areas that could have been better? And with all of these conversations, it comes down to these three elements, right? People, process, and technology. On the people side, end users could have been more aware about what needs to happen when that playbook runs, or during a restoration, or contingency plans. But this other piece, shadow IT, is a pretty common thing you see generally in larger organizations, but even in smaller ones I've seen, where, employees use technologies that are outside the eyes of the company's security inspection, right? If you don't know it's there, you can't protect it. That's one of the pieces, where, taking an inventory of what you have is helpful. Sometimes it's not that easy to do, but it's certainly something that needs to happen. From a process, standpoint, regular pen tests, vulnerability scans would have caught that open port that led to that initial compromise. Also, their governance, are you reviewing what your environment looks like? Do you have old accounts out there that could be compromised? Things like that. And then on the technology side, I think if there was an increased interest in usage of some third-party resources to fill in gaps that probably would have helped, like managed threat detection and response, which is where you have those 24/7 eyes on your environment. So you see what's going on, because not everybody has the luxury of a 24/7, security center in their business or can afford it. And part of that is normally the advanced threat protection pieces. Machine learning and AI comes in when, you have products like log aggregation, where you bring the logs in and they can, look at all these events and do some, run some algorithms on them and understand what's going on, either for, threats that are occurring or maybe ones that are sitting dormant.
Hey, Dave, let me just ask you on,
Sure.
Since you did this, you played a role in this for your previous organization.
Mhm.
Maybe you're not totally up to speed on all the things from an insurance premium perspective.
Yep.
What of these things are sort of table stakes at this point?
Well, table stakes at this point are probably the end user training and the managed threat detection. I think 20 years ago was when table stakes became, hey, I've got antivirus, signature-based antivirus on my PCs, and maybe even on the servers if you were lucky that it didn't,
Yep.
drag your servers down. Now, and that was always, hey, we'll install it, we're good, set it, forget it kind of thing. The alert comes up, great. Now I believe table stakes are, well, who's watching it? Who's watching it 24/7? Because number one, not everybody's in the office and can, be caught behind your, walled garden. And, number two, people work outside of normal business hours, right? And you may have locations in different time zones. Who's watching it? If an alert comes up, who's going to look at it and who's going to know whether it's real or not? So I think really that managed SOC, or that managed threat detection and response piece, is now becoming table stakes. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when it comes to cyber insurance.
Thanks.
So what I want to talk about next is furthering that layered approach conversation and some common ways that it can be approached. And these are frameworks, but if you look at it, from like, well, this is basic, this is okay, kind of your base level. It's problem here is it's very manual. Technologies are limited, as Steve talked about, like VPN. It's very, you're either trusted or you're not. You're hairpinning traffic, meaning you're sending traffic to a central location to go back out, because a lot of people have cloud applications. So it's kind of inefficient. And then just the processes for, say, restoring, really manual. As we show here, you can insert something to a USB drive, boot it up, and you're re-imaging. That's probably like 20-year-old technology. Then you move on to maybe a better approach where you start layering on some lower cost solutions and some awareness, since people are a big attack vector. We're starting to see organizations move here. I think more and more folks realize they have to turn on multi-factor or two-factor authentication. They're also realizing that, they're moving their files out to the cloud. So they need to look at how we're going to secure that. And we'll look at that in the next approach. But really, this is about addressing the most common areas for compromise. And then, like the best, which we're calling it here, next gen cybersecurity. I hope it's no longer next gen and it's current gen. But this is, desktop as a service if you still have a lot of client server applications, because it's much easier to secure and lock down a desktop as a service environment versus just PCs all over the place. Multi-factor with single sign-on capabilities. And I want to really point out single sign-on. Probably one of the most important things I did at my last company was move to a single sign-on solution. And what is that? That means that you can take a single set of credentials protected with multi-factor authentication and use that to access all of your applications. So what is that? What's the big deal there? It sounds like, well, now you have a single place for somebody to compromise. True. However, if you think about it from the onboarding and offboarding of folks, specifically offboarding, somebody gets terminated, it's a lot easier and more manageable to terminate one account than it is 20 accounts. So it's more about your threat surface more than anything else. And of course, backups and managed threat detection. Backups, as Steve talked about, being offsite, air gapped, even to the point of if you, for whatever reason, can't do offsite, you look at immutable backup options. Immutable meaning they can't be changed. So if you were to be compromised, your backups aren't compromised. So that's really where, I think that's really where people need to focus, is how best to shift your thinking and shift your environment towards that, best approach when it comes to cybersecurity. Go to the next slide. So cyber insurance, we talked a lot about that. Not going to go through every single bullet point here, but really this is about, is it worth the cost, right? Everything in business is, cost versus benefit. So what I want to focus on here is the aftermath versus just paying out a ransom, because paying out ransom has its own set of liabilities, such as, just for example, federal government starting to look at that as potential terrorist funding. These folks that are sending out ransomware, how do you know they're not, an enemy of the state or, terrorists or whatever? So there's liability in paying out that ransom, which is why, again, we recommend having those negotiators and those lawyers ready to go, because there are implications to doing that. It's not just as easy as put my money down, get my stuff back. You have other costs. This is one of the reasons why cyber insurance makes a lot of sense. You have these other costs, the incident response costs that you saw, all of those steps that were taken to reconstitute, there's costs associated to that. The downtime. One of the things in my last company that we did as an exercise and as an executive team was say, well, how much money is it costing the business to be down every hour? So we put an hourly cost to it. And that helped do that cost benefit calculation when I say, well, okay, if insurance costs us, $15K annually, but it costs us $40,000 an hour to be down, well, that's an easy calculation, right? So that's something to be very aware of. And then the other piece of this is the security expertise to help navigate this entire thing. In my experience and across our customer base, there's not a lot of people that have high-end security resources on staff that do this a lot to be proficient at it. You may have some really smart network folks and IT folks, but are they responding to these things all the time to where they're going to be proficient and be able to knock through it effectively? Probably not. And in some cases, you might need public relations assistance because your breach needed to be sent out as a notification because there was data exfiltration. But ultimately, I think you have to look at this within the lens of, if you had to put a claim in, would you be able to collect on it? And I think the thing here is to be aware of is that cyber insurance carriers are increasing their requirements for coverage. And what they're doing is they're really scrutinizing the policyholder security posture. So they expect that you'll have solid protections in place to guard against compromise, but also to be able to recover. So if you don't measure up, they may not even write a policy at all, right? So these are the things that you have to get straight before you even go into those conversations. And we know this from personal experience and from clients that have told us, literally, they've come to us says, hey, our insurance carrier says we can't get coverage unless we have these controls in place. But I think, again, it comes down to a bigger conversation. An old CFO of mine once said, insurance is great, but it doesn't save the business, right? While it may be worth the cost of insurance to help with that aftermath, you know, it can account for things like loss of reputation or lost customers, right? You're responsible for saving your business, not the insurance company. So I think I'll end the slide on that little statement, and we'll move on to the next. All right. So protecting your data. Yeah, if you can't describe how you're protecting it, you probably aren't. Goes along the lines of if you don't know what you have, you don't know what to protect. So next slide. And this one, Mike is going to help me out a bit here, and he's going to grill me a little bit.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask Dave to take off his ARG hat and find his old CIO hat and put that back on for me for a moment. But Dave, in your old organization or your previous organization, how did you know? What steps did you take to know what you had?
Yeah, so what we did is we put in place some asset discovery tools. Our environment was it was medium size. We probably had several thousand network nodes. But even for very small environments, you know, there's a lot of asset discovery tools out there that it goes out to the network, it sees what you have. The important thing here is that not only do you get a baseline of what you have, but continuous scans can show you what's changed, not only through what devices are on the network, but what software is installed and so on and so forth. So the first thing was there. But the other piece that we did was we looked at key business assets, not just files, right? We looked at administrative departments. We looked across the environment. We had multiple business units. So we looked at things to keep in mind. You want to look at things like your HVAC controls, right? Access to bathrooms if you can't work from home, right? These are all things to know what you have and make sure that you can bring those things back up in the event of a loss, right? A loss may not just be a cyber loss, and I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but you know, physical access to the building. What if there's a hazmat incident close by, right? So you want to know what all of your assets are, both physical and virtual, and that's how we did it. We had to collaborate with all the business units to say, what are the important business assets, and we documented them.
How often did you test your backup and recovery plan?
That got tested.
Be honest.
Yeah, it got tested in two ways. That our DR got tested fairly frequently because we had a good sized WAN and we would lose circuits, so we would have to test that. We generally, at least once a year, would do some testing. I wouldn't say it was comprehensive. We did more tabletop exercises where I would attempt to corral the executive team to go through a, you know, kind of a, hey, let's do a reality check on what we have. That's not always very easy. But on the technical side, I think we were pretty good at doing it at least once a year. We should have been doing them probably quarterly. That's probably a better thing to do, but it's not always realistic. I had a very lean IT group. It wasn't always easy to do that.
When I think about kind of these next three questions, I may just combine them into kind of a two-parter. One is how did you manage all of your identities, and then what is the difference between MFA, SSO, and zero trust, and how do those two things, maybe a three-part question, work together?
Sure. Let's start with zero trust. Zero trust is really, it's a concept, right? Think about it as it's really just a fancy term for least privileged access, right? So zero trust says we don't trust anybody. You have to prove that you're trustworthy either through authenticating or maybe your endpoint device posture, your location. There's a bunch of different ways that you can test for these things. I'll give a very specific example. VPNs. Most VPNs, when you connect in, everything that goes through that VPN is now trusted. right? Zero Trust would say, sure, you can authenticate to my VPN concentrator, but unless you have antivirus and unless you're on this version of Windows, et cetera, and you're in this location, we won't allow you to get to this particular network or this particular host, right? So it's really about the least privilege somebody needs to be able to do their job. And then as far as managing identities, that's where that single sign-on came into play. Single sign-on meaning it's a platform that it takes credentials and then uses them for other platforms. Easier said than done. Not every application out there supports single sign-on, but it's a way to start shifting that way. How we dealt with it, so I'll say our compensating controls for that was our processes with onboarding and offboarding employees. We had a very specific process that we worked with our HR group with executive, I'll say, support, meaning if people didn't do it, they had to answer to the executive team, to be able to say, well, when a person's onboarded, these are the steps based on their department, what takes to set them up. And then when they leave, these are the steps to basically lock them out and, deprovision them. So we took a process approach, following through our ITSM or our service management software. But you don't need fancy software for this. It's really about your process. And did we do regular checks of our Active Directory for accounts that haven't been used once in a while? We did, probably not as frequently as we should have. Really, it would have been as easy as creating an Outlook, reminder on a shared calendar to say, hey, time to go through. And you can run scripts in your Active Directory, whether it's on-prem or Azure, to say, hey, which accounts haven't logged in 90 days? Well, we need to check that, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip the next few because I think the story that you and Steve told around being training your staff, being an informed skeptic. I mean, even the example that Steve walked us through, it was the staff early in the morning discovering that files and then being skeptical enough to elevate that into the IT team. So that can't be understated, just the human element of that. But
No.
Tell me about how you developed a risk management program and kind of what that is and what it means for what it meant to your organization.
Yeah, this is, in my opinion, the toughest thing to do. It's kind of like getting that big boulder just up over the peak to get it rolling. It's a large and nebulous concept. There's no question. However, how we did it was we brought in a third party, and I'll talk about that in a second. But really, you start with doing a business impact analysis. Really, that's taking inventory of the business, knowing what your key assets are and how they would be affected if they're no longer available. Again, I'm oversimplifying it, but that's really the first step in analyzing your security posture and looking at your risk. Okay. So I'm going to come back to the third party thing because everyone has a day job. If there's one thing that I can tell you in my 20 plus years of running IT, but even longer being in IT, nobody wants to do this stuff. Everybody is busy doing other things. It's almost impossible to corral people to do this stuff. Bringing in an outside influence and somebody dedicated to doing this, I think is the most prudent way. And that's how, believe it or not, that's how I got my very first business continuity plan done, was I brought in an outside consulting agency to do that because they kept people on track. They were the ones going out, questioning all of the major stakeholders and putting that material together. So unless you literally have a PMO or some organization in your company that's all they do, that's how I accomplished it.
Great. All right, confession time's over. We'll let you move on.
And no problem.
Yep.
All right. So next question is, are you confident that your insurance company would pay out in the event of a cybersecurity attack? So you can go ahead and put your answers in there. Yeah.
Love the first one. Nope.
Nope. Nope. Yeah. And look, it's not uncommon.
Mhm.
That's assuming you do have insurance, of course.
Dave, just a quick time check. We got about 10, 15 minutes left.
Okay.
Number
All right.
3, I think we're pacing
Yeah.
well.
And so this is going to be pretty straightforward. You know, really what's your elevator pitch? And let's go to the next slide. This is about how bad are things, I guess, and really, is your security posture in such a condition that an audit is an easy thing, or is it a mess? And you're going to get these slides. I really suggest that you go through these things and do a little bit of introspection, because this, I think, is a really good playbook for having conversations with your executive team, or if you are the executive team, maybe your other executives, to get a reality check on really how your posture looks. And here's some resources. I really like the CIS Top 18. It's a great place to start if you want a simple, easy to understand, set of controls that you can put in place that really cover a lot of the basics. And then as you work your way down, you get more in-depth control frameworks like NIST, and then CMMC, which is a certification for those that are in the defense industrial base, and then ISO certification if you've got international considerations. Those are much more in-depth and take a lot more time and money to invest in, but good things to look at. And by the way, ISO is something you have to pay for, whereas the rest of those, that information is free.
Dave, would you take just 25, 30 seconds on CMMC? Because we're starting to see, as we work specifically in GovCon or those supporting federal customers, we're seeing that requirement, although it's a little gray on timing and seems to be a bit of a moving target, it's still becoming one of the critical requirements in evaluating new partners.
It is. It's still being worked out at least as of July or early August. There were only 2 C3PAOs, which are the certifying bodies. There were only 2 that passed that, but they have to pass CMMC themselves. So it's not, all the details aren't worked out, but I think right now the target is around 2026 for all contractors to be certified, but that's going to go in stages. Like, not everyone has to get it right now. It's going to go in stages depending on your engagement with the government.
Cool. So
yeah,
I'll let you ask the last question.
Yeah, and
Second
do you
question.
believe your staff is knowledgeable enough to avoid clicking on a phishing email? I like to say, do you have a paranoid enough user base?
Yeah, not uncommon, especially around the holidays. You start seeing the the FedEx, UPS, American Postal Service, or United Postal Service. Hey, we got your invoice for your gifts, and
Right.
Just becomes a little bit harder.
Yep.
You're getting more of those types of emails.
I think we got a lot of answers. Good.
Yeah.
Depends on the staff.
All right.
Yeah,
So,
that's true. Oh, yeah.
So I'll just take us home, and then interaction on the chat has been unbelievable. If you want to send us a private message, or you want to send something publicly, or even for the group, if you'd like to share a thought, we'd love to do the fire round. But just some fresh perspective here. There are 11 Gartner Magic Quadrants on cybersecurity. There are literally thousands of options here. Processing through which options would be the right choice can be overwhelming and challenging. Go to the next slide. One of the things that we help our clients with is just whenever you set your most critical kind of business criteria or drivers, as you start to prioritize one driver over another, that will come with trade-offs. And this is just one example of that. Documenting those requirements, really processing through the approaches that you could take and what the business impact could be on approach 1 versus approach 2 versus approach 3. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing dialogue internally. You can make incremental improvements as long as you understand the strengths, weaknesses, and risks to the organization and what those trade-offs might be. Sometimes it's cost, other times it's feature or functionality or integration into other services. So we'll go to the next slide here, and then we'll open it up to questions. So as we're thinking through kind of how to make that thoughtful decision process, there are just some elements of this. This is a big part of what Steve Murphy partners with Dave and our team on with our clients every single day, is just identifying the business value, making sure you are inclusive in the decision. There are going to be key stakeholders that are going to be affected by that technology change, engaging them early and often in the process, gathering their requirements, understanding where some of the change management may need to happen, can get them on board early as that technology change comes. Identify success criteria, evaluate existing investments, research the marketplace. All of these steps really can't be skipped to get all the way down to the end, where as long as you've processed through all the assumptions of the organization, the conclusion should be, pretty obvious and well validated. So we'll provide this to you as a framework for decision making as part of the deck that you all have. Some of this is common sense. Others of it is, hey, we really should be engaging. Like, we think you should engage key stakeholders, identify them early, document who they might be, and engage them in the process right away. That's probably, of all the steps, one of the things that we see most commonly skipped or overlooked or underutilized. Let's go to the final slide here. All right, so we'll pause here for a moment, and I think we've got 10, 12 minutes. If we have any questions, absolutely would love to field anything and all that you have. If you want to direct message us because you want to have it anonymous, we'll certainly read the question to the group and keep your name private. But if you've got anything that you'd like to discuss while we have Dave and Steve here, we'd love to engage in that dialogue with you.
Mike, there was one question at the beginning, like from Adema. She asked about ransomware affecting SaaS and 365, OneDrive, and SharePoint. And I thought that was a really great question. So
great question.
It can be a help, but it may also be an attack vector. So there's a couple different things about 365. Even if you have Google, it doesn't really matter. The first thing, as far as file storage, in most cases, unless you're doing strictly, everybody is only doing things from a web page, you're going to have local file sync applications. Well, if somebody gets compromised on their local PC and it starts, crypto locking, they could crypto lock right within there. And then, of course, that's going to replicate out to your cloud storage. So that's something to be aware of. But the other piece that I think is even more important is, how is your environment configured? Do you have all the locks on the doors? We hear about things like Amazon S3 buckets having default passwords. Well, same thing can happen in Azure or in GCP. So I think it's important that someone who really understands the security posture of those cloud service providers, the hyperscalers, gets in there and makes sure that those things are all locked up. But it can help in one sense, but you're still exposed in another.
Hackers are generally a pretty lazy group.
Yeah.
Yes. So can you expand a little bit? Thank you for answering my question. Sure. In terms of other options or third-party options that you can use, to then get that additional backup, in addition to the backups that we're doing in Azure and for our Office 365 data that is stored in SharePoint and OneDrive. Can you talk a little bit more about some other third-party solutions or options that you could do for that extra protection?
Sure, Mike, do you want to take that, or I can talk in kind of general?
No, go for it.
All right.
Yeah, let's talk in general terms.
So, yeah, 100%. Like we were talking about, especially if you have cloud environments, Microsoft is not backing up your data. They're just not. They do it within their data centers, unless maybe you buy that package. But again, I don't tend to like to trust Microsoft or Google or anybody with my stuff. I want it. So at my last company, we had a third-party cloud backup solution. So I generally recommend those. You want it to go somewhere else. And, we certainly can help with that because there's several options there. But as a general recommendation, yes, you want a third-party cloud backup solution that can take care of that.
Thank you.
Sure.
We currently back up in Azure, so we do have that additional service.
Yeah, and I'm even saying in some cases you want to get a third party.
Yes.
Right.
Thank
Fair
you.
enough. Sure.
Thanks for sharing. Anybody else have anything for the team?
Let's see. Erica, do we miss any questions in there? I'm scrolling through, but.
I think we got most of them.
Hey, Dave, just one that comes up frequently in client conversations. What about encryption at rest? If I encrypt at rest, am I safe from ransomware?
No, because encryption at rest just means that, let's say you've got a storage area network or a hard drive that's encrypted. It just means when you power it off, somebody can't just take the data and look at it. But generally your servers are running and your machines are running. So if they're running, your files can get encrypted. That's really all the purpose behind encryption at rest is in the case of physical theft. That's the primary reason. And folks use that, they call it crypto shredding, where what they do is if they know they're getting rid of hard drives, they'll encrypt the drive and then wipe the data. So that way there's just no chance of recovering with the tools.
Good, Steve. So if we don't have any more questions, we're actually ending on time, which is always a good thing. Nicole, thank you so much for hosting us and allowing us to do this with the group here. If anybody has any follow-up questions, certainly you've got all of our contact information here, generally info@myarg, or feel free to reach out to me, Steve, or Dave directly. Our contact information's on the screen there. Thanks so much for the time. I recognize a few of the names on here. Dave, Steve, thank you for sharing, Erica coordinating, and the UST team for including us. Thank you so much.